Hi, federal government. It's Professor Green. I hope you all are well. I just wanted to say hello first, and then also make a note to some of you who may not know, but your Smart Book 2.0 assignments for 1 through 6 have been extended through the 15th rather than the 12th, so you get a couple of extra days to complete those if you need time. If you're completely finished, that's great. I will go ahead and assign 7 through 12, even though we haven't taken our test, so that you can go ahead and work on that per some of your requests. You will still have the same amount of time to complete them, so if you're not comfortable working ahead, don't do it. If you think it's going to get you mixed up for any reason, I would not suggest doing that. So, we just discussed civil liberties, and we know that civil liberties involve your individual rights that are guaranteed protection from the government. So initially, the federal government, that was the deal. The federal government was held to those Bill of Rights, and that's why they were created. Well, then later on, the states started saying that they weren't going to be held to those standards because those were federal government rights. They weren't anything that the states were required to adhere to. So that's when you had individuals like Gideon, Mrs. Mapp. Let's see, and you'll see some more cases that relate to the 14th Amendment that apply to equal rights rather than civil liberties. But Gideon, Miranda versus Arizona, that was the Miranda rights. Nix versus Williams, just to name a few. And we talked about a lot of things, including freedom of religion with the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. We talked about freedom of speech, symbolic speech, libel, slander. You know, I could go on and on about Chapter 4 and what we learned there. But the most important thing that you need to remember about Chapter 4 and Chapter 5 is that they both deal with the 14th Amendment. They deal, however, with different clauses. We're looking specifically at the Incorporation Clause and the Equal Protection Clause in Chapter 5. And as you can see, the chapter is entitled Equal Rights, Struggling for Fairness. And so the author indicated throughout our chapter that it is indeed a struggle and continues to be a struggle for these groups. And we'll learn that it's not just one group that's affected, it's many groups. And unfortunately, treating people equally seems to be complex for some people. And you have to think that when we came over here and we were trying to make it, and you saw colonies failing and you saw colonies disappearing, that you really had to look out for yourself. So that whole self-sufficiency thing, we didn't want England's help, we didn't want them bothering us. That was great and all, but at the same time, it brought a lot of responsibility on us so that we didn't starve. You know, we had to go out and figure out how we were going to live. So that's, I think, when you get into that mindset of do what you have to do. And unfortunately, that led to a lot of unequal treatment. And unfortunately, as we noted at the beginning of the book, instead of addressing those issues head on, they chose compromises. And then they delayed what would be inevitable. And we saw that later, right after the Dred Scott decision in 1857, you saw the Civil War come about around 1861 to 1865. So these compromises have their consequences. So we'll get a little bit into that in just a moment. But the struggle is important, and there will be an ongoing struggle, and there obviously is an ongoing struggle. I am encouraged by the solidarity that has been shown in the protest. I have been encouraged, you know, by a lot of things that I've seen. I think that everything will be okay, you know, in a few years. I don't. But I'm hopeful that it will start getting better, that people will start holding their governments accountable when they see injustices like they have. And I do find it encouraging that, you know, people took to the streets. And because I'm a firm believer in that First Amendment, and you can exercise your freedom of speech, except for, and then you go through those exceptions that we went through last class period. No obscenity. I don't have an issue with that. Anyway, we won't get into the whole freedom of speech issue, but I very much respect that people took to the streets in solidarity to speak for the voices that have no voice any longer. And they may be speaking for future voices that won't be able to speak any longer. So you want that inequality to end, but getting there is going to be a struggle. All right, moving on to our definitions. Number one, let me move my picture way over here. Equal rights. So, not liberties, rights. The right of every person to equal protection under the laws and equal access to society's opportunities and public facilities. And so that became problematic after the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments were passed, and then we had Reconstruction, and then you had Jim Crow laws being enacted. And then all of that had to be addressed somehow. And so we see throughout this chapter struggle after struggle after struggle. So the second one is the Equal Protection Clause, and we've gone over that one. I believe it's at the end of the 14th Amendment. It forbids any state to deny equal protection of the laws to any individual within its jurisdiction. Reasonable basis test. These are some tests that the court has developed over time. So there's actually three. One is not in here, and you could just put it right in between these. Strict scrutiny is the highest test. That's the hardest test that the court uses to determine if someone has discriminated against someone unequally. So if a person is identified as a suspect class, so if they are of a certain ethnicity or race, they get protection. And so we'll see how that came about. And then you have intermediate scrutiny, which applies to gender. We're not quite at a suspect classification, although with the Me Too movement, you almost start to see that we could potentially get there if people aren't checked. So that's just something to consider. We could change as far as where we're at as far as these tests go. And then finally you have the reasonable basis test, which deals more with age, income, and things of that nature. And we'll talk about all three of those, including intermediate scrutiny, which is not in here, but you still need to know it. And then suspect classifications. So I've already told you a little bit about that, but we'll go over that definition one more time. But I would group all of these 3, 4, 5 together. Then I would group these last three together: affirmative action, de jure discrimination, and de facto discrimination. These two in particular, because they're dealing with two different forms of discrimination. And affirmative action is dealing with how you go about responding to those forms of discrimination. So let's look at our learning objectives for Chapter 5. 5.1, we want to trace the history of equality through the law. 5.2, demonstrate knowledge of the context of the African American civil rights movement. 5.3, demonstrate knowledge of the civil rights movement for women. 5.4, identify civil rights battles being fought by minority groups. And then 5.5, evaluate the significance of demographic changes in the United States. So, with that said, we are going to have a change with the demographic structure. I believe the book noted in 2050, if you combine Asian Americans, African Americans, and Hispanics, those three groups will outnumber Anglo populations. And even in Texas, in 2020, the Hispanic population should overtake that of the Anglo population, according to statistics, but we're still waiting for census data to confirm that. But again, it's something that we need to take into consideration. All right, so two important cases that I'm going to require that you watch is the Dred Scott decision and then the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. And then you notice that between these two cases, the Civil War was fought.
In Kansas, for example, bloody fighting erupted between northern and southern settlers who fought to establish Bleeding Kansas as either a slave state or a free state. In the midst of all this fighting, northern abolitionists were preventing slave catchers from forcing runaway slaves back into slavery. Chief Justice Roger Taney and the court thought they could prevent civil war with the 1857 decision in Dred Scott v. Sanford. Historical context is important in understanding this landmark case. Congress had been trying for decades to resolve the tensions between slave states and free states through carefully crafted compromises. For example, the 1820 Missouri Compromise allowed Maine to enter the Union as a free state and Missouri as a slave state. The compromise also banned slavery in the Louisiana Territory north of the 3630 parallel, while allowing it in territory south of that line. Dred Scott was a slave who lived in Missouri and eventually moved with his master to the free states of Illinois and Wisconsin. When Dred Scott's master moved back to Missouri, Dred Scott sued for his freedom, claiming that he became free when they moved to the northern free states. The Supreme Court agreed to hear the case, as they hoped it would settle political tensions surrounding slavery. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, a supporter of the South, wanted a firm, united action against northern abolitionist sentiment. So, in ruling on the case, he arrogantly tried to settle the highly charged issue of slavery himself once and for all, rather than see Congress, which had debated the issue carefully for decades, plan out a solution. In a controversial 7-2 decision, the court decided that African Americans were not citizens. Therefore, they did not have the right to sue in court. Writing the decision for the court, Taney incorrectly and stubbornly claimed that the founders believed that African Americans had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. He ruled that Congress did not have the constitutional authority to ban slavery from the states, and therefore the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. Taney decided this despite Article 4, Section 3 of the Constitution, which reads, "Congress shall have power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States." Because of the Due Process Clause, Taney wrote, slaveholders could take their property wherever they wanted, and slavery could not be prohibited in any state or territory. One of the dissenters, Justice Benjamin Curtis, correctly asserted that free blacks were citizens with the right to vote in 5 states at the time of the founding. He wrote, "It would be strange if we were to find in the Constitution anything which deprived of their citizenship any part of the people of the United States who were among those by whom it was established." Contrary to Taney's intentions, the Dred Scott decision significantly heightened sectional tensions between North and South and contributed to the coming of the Civil War 4 years later. The case is seen as an infamous travesty of injustice and one of the worst decisions in the history of the Supreme Court. For more information on this and many other important court cases throughout history, be sure to check out the other videos in our Homework Help series.
After the Civil War, the United States embarked on an era of Reconstruction, during which the country grappled with the painful history of slavery. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution sought to eradicate the taint of slavery by outlawing it and guaranteeing black citizens equal treatment under the law and the right to vote. However, there was a lot of resistance to racial equality, particularly in the South. By the 1870s, Reconstruction had fizzled out, giving way to the Jim Crow era. Named after the minstrel show Jump Jim Crow, this period was defined by racial segregation laws passed by Southern states. Plessy v. Ferguson is the now infamous case in which the United States Supreme Court declared it constitutional for races to be kept separate. In 1892, Homer Plessy took a trip. He bought a first-class ticket, got onto the train, and settled in one of the coaches. The conductor told Plessy to move to a different coach, but he refused. So Plessy was thrown off the train and into a jail cell. Under an 1890 state law, railways within Louisiana were required to have, quote, equal but separate, unquote, coaches for black and white passengers. Anyone refusing to sit in the assigned coach could be fined $25 or imprisoned for up to 20 days. As a U.S. citizen who was 7/8 white and 1/8 black, Plessy argued that he was white and deserved to sit in the coach reserved for white passengers. However, under Louisiana law, Plessy was considered black. So Plessy was put on trial in state court for breaking the law by sitting in the wrong coach. At trial, Plessy argued that the law was unconstitutional, but the government disagreed. Judge Ferguson sided with the government. If convicted, Plessy would be sentenced to prison and charged a fine. Plessy asked the Louisiana Supreme Court to issue a writ of prohibition against Judge Ferguson to prevent him from enforcing the law. But the Louisiana Supreme Court found the law constitutional. So Plessy asked for a writ of error from the United States Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court reviewed the case to determine whether the Louisiana law requiring racially segregated railway coaches was constitutional. Writing for the majority, Justice Brown concluded that the law didn't violate the 14th Amendment. The amendment was designed to make everyone equal under the law, but it wasn't intended to eliminate distinctions based on race. The majority thought that political equality of the races wasn't compromised by segregation. State laws creating racially segregated facilities thus didn't violate the Equal Protection Clause if those facilities were, quote, separate but equal, unquote. Laws requiring segregation could be legitimate exercises of state police power, provided they were reasonable and based on good faith rather than racist motives. Here, Louisiana was simply respecting the fact that the two races preferred remaining segregated. In other words, it wasn't the law's job or even within the law's power to force the races to mix. The court also found that the 13th Amendment, which Plessy argued was violated by the Louisiana law, was a non-issue because the case had nothing to do with abolishing slavery or involuntary servitude. Therefore, the court affirmed the Louisiana Supreme Court's decision. In a powerful dissent, Justice Harlan found that the Louisiana law was discriminatory because it sought to keep black passengers from coaches reserved for white passengers. Harlan stated that the law was clearly intended to keep black people away from white people. This was a violation of civil rights. Harlan said the Constitution is colorblind, and so a state couldn't constitutionally deprive citizens of their rights based on their races. For Justice Harlan, the majority's decision was like the Supreme Court's infamous self-inflicted wound in Dred Scott v. Sanford. Harlan thought Plessy would foster animosity and basically predicted that it would be overturned. Harlan would have found the Louisiana law unconstitutional. It's worth noting, however, that as progressive as Justice Harlan's views were, he didn't believe in equal rights for all mankind. His dissent distinguished Chinese people, and he didn't quibble with the exclusion of the Chinese race from citizenship. The Supreme Court's decision in Plessy v. Ferguson justified racial discrimination in the United States based on the separate but equal doctrine. In 1954, Plessy was finally overturned by Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka.
So I hope you seeing Dred Scott and Plessy play out in those two videos helps you understand that this concept of equality has been lacking on the part of our government and our Supreme Court. So equality definitely wasn't their first and foremost consideration during those decisions. All right, so we're going to look at Learning Objective 5.1. We're going to trace the history of equality through the law. So our first definition is equal rights, and they also want you to look at civil liberties as well. So know the difference between the two. I'm not going to go over civil liberties again, but equal rights is the right of every person to equal protection under the laws. I wish I had my box. I don't have my box like I do in Blackboard. So you have equal protection under the laws and equal access to society's opportunities and public facilities. So school, work, libraries, etc. So everybody should be able to enjoy these things. It shouldn't be one person or one race enjoying something while the other race has to sit out. I think they even had like swimming times where they divided the swimming hours at the public pools. There are just so many horrible stories from some of the Reconstruction era up through the 60s, 1960s, that it's actually a really, honestly, kind of depressing chapter, because I start remembering some of the stories that I heard regarding civil rights and the treatment of people, and it just seems horrible, and it seems like something that was unnecessary. But anyway, hopefully we can figure that out. But within the book, as far as equality and through the law, Thomas Jefferson said he didn't even know what it meant when he was saying all men were created equal. So he couldn't give a precise meaning to that, all men were created equal. In the eyes of the law is how it's supposed to be interpreted. It said, nevertheless, the promise contained in that phrase has a placed history on the side of those seeking greater equality. Every civil rights movement, from suffrage for males without property in the 1830s to LGBTQ rights today, has derived moral strength from the nation's pledge of equality for all. Those efforts have led to policies that have made Americans more equal in law. And you will definitely see some progress over time. So that is encouraging. So you take the bad, and then you take some of the good. And hopefully the good starts outweighing the bad eventually. The sooner the better, in my opinion. Okay, so the next learning objective that we want to look at is 5.2. We want to demonstrate knowledge of the context of the African American Civil Rights Movement. So we already know that before going into the Civil Rights Movement, we had the decisions of Dred Scott and Plessy v. Ferguson on the books as U.S. precedent. So equality wasn't there. Then you had Jim Crow laws going into effect. You had white primaries. You had poll taxes. You had literacy tests. You just had people treating people very badly from the time of Reconstruction, especially in the southern states. So the idea of equality was a great idea, but for whatever reason, it wasn't being addressed as it should have been. And so it took some strong individuals to bring that to the table and bring that to the attention of the Supreme Court. And so we'll begin to see some of those individuals, who they were, and why they are important, extremely important, to the progress that has been made over time for equal treatment of some groups. So this is a former test question that I included. The 14th Amendment applies to discriminatory action by the government. So that's just noting that the incorporation clause and the enforcement clause. So this is how the equal protection clause is enforced against the individuals who are discriminating against whatever group they are discriminating against. And then we want to look at Brown versus Board of Education. So this is another Bill of Rights Institute video. It's very good. And it explains how, despite the rulings of, of separate but equal, eventually they wanted the concept gone. And there are a number of cases where the Supreme Court started chipping away at getting separate but equal off the books, or Plessy v. Ferguson off the books. But Brown v. Board is the case that does it. And you have Thurgood Marshall, later an Associate Justice, who is trying the case. And he was actually trained by Charles Houston, and Charles Houston was a very good attorney with the NAACP, and he argued a great deal of cases before the Supreme Court from the 30s and through the 50s before he passed away. And so he was the person that gave Thurgood Marshall his training. And this was a 9-0 unanimous decision by the court, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But give me a moment to let you watch that.
Racial tension related to segregation has fueled some of the most important court cases in American history. Maybe the most important case which dealt with segregation in the United States was the 1954 case of Brown v. the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. To understand this landmark case, it's important to appreciate some context. The Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment reads, "No state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws." However, the Supreme Court denied equal justice in the 1896 case of Plessy v. Ferguson, as the court used the idea of separate but equal to give official government approval to segregation in America. Almost 50 years later, Thurgood Marshall, a lawyer for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, led the charge in arguing that the segregation of schools violated the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. Several similar segregation questions from different parts of the country were combined into one case, and the case of Linda Brown, a third-grade African-American student from Topeka, Kansas, led the list. Just like many of the other cases that were combined into hers, Linda was denied acceptance into white schools close to her home and was forced to attend a school miles away. While separate was considered equal at the time, Thurgood Marshall argued for the African-American families that white school facilities were often of much higher quality than the separate schools for blacks. Interestingly, in Topeka, there was really no difference in the quality of the two sets of schools. The school for blacks was equally well equipped and had excellent teachers. This focuses attention on the more important question: can schools really be equal if students are segregated merely on the basis of skin color? The Supreme Court heard arguments in the case in 1953, but the justices were deeply divided. They decided to put the case on hold to allow for new briefs and arguments. While the case was on hold, Chief Justice Fred Vinson died and was replaced by California Governor Earl Warren, who believed segregation was unconstitutional. Warren, understanding that many in the South would resist the decision, believed a unanimous decision was important to give the court's ruling legitimacy. When the case resumed in 1954, the court was still divided. Most justices believed that segregation was a violation of the 14th Amendment's Equality Clause, but some believed it was a federalism issue and decisions about how to end segregation should be left at the states. The question remained: can schools really be equal if students are segregated merely based on the color of their skin? Chief Justice Warren wrote and rewrote the court's decision until he had finally achieved a unanimous opinion. Leaving the question of the equality of the schools aside, Warren wrote, "We must look instead to the effect of segregation itself on public education." So, rather than focusing on whether there was equal opportunity to attend school, they looked at the ill effects of segregation on society. The court based this decision partly on controversial doll experiments used to make the argument that separating students solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority. In a unanimous decision, the court ruled that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Therefore, the plaintiffs were deprived of the equal protection of the laws guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. Although some Southerners engaged in a massive resistance campaign in which they refused to follow the decision, many Southern communities gradually desegregated their schools in the coming years. The decision in Brown v. the Board of Education helped to chip away at racist social structure by outlawing segregation in schools. It helped to stimulate the Civil Rights Movement, culminating a decade later in the Civil Rights Act, which banned segregation in all public facilities, and the Voting Rights Act, which outlawed racially discriminatory voting restrictions. For more information on this and many other important court cases throughout history, be sure to check out the other videos in our Homework Help series.
Okay, so now that you're familiar with Brown v. Board and the unanimous decision that was made, these are some of the individuals involved. If it would help you to remember the concept, this is Charles Houston. Now he was, I believe he died in 1950, but he was the mentor of Thurgood Marshall, who would litigate the case, both attorneys for the NAACP. And under Charles Houston's photograph, it says he's an attorney known as the man who killed Jim Crow. He was a civil rights attorney who worked for the NAACP and argued before the Supreme Court from 1930 to 1950 and trained Thurgood Marshall. And it says that Thurgood Marshall was the lead attorney in Brown versus Board. He was an NAACP attorney and later appointed as a Supreme Court Justice or Associate Justice in 1967 by LBJ. He had 24 years of service on the Supreme Court and is regarded as one of the most liberal associate justices the court has seen. And then you have Earl Warren, who was, in fact, the governor of California prior to being seated on the bench. He was the Chief Justice at the time of Brown v. Board. He wrote the unanimous 9-0 decision, and he was appointed by a Republican, Eisenhower. And so he is regarded as one of the most liberal Chief Justices to ever serve in the court. So that's just a little background information for you. Some very, very significant people as far as the law is concerned. All right, and so this is just a headline. Segregation in public schools ended by the court. I don't know that there's another headline, but I had found multiples. So if you would like to see some of the headlines, it went around the nation. So everyone heard of this decision. It was heard around the nation, heard around the world, I'm sure. But it says, in the early 20th century, activists generally pursued civil rights through legal action, with a historic victory in 1954 with Brown v. Board. So I would put a star on this page. This is generally a test question. So Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka in 54 banned forced segregation in schools. And it is important to note that Black activists pursued civil rights through legal action like Brown v. Board. So you'll see in a moment the ACLU is another group, the Americans for Civil Liberties Union. So they would advocate on behalf and still do. And, you know, and they're involved in our current election as far as voter suppression claims. So they've already filed many lawsuits alleging voter suppression already. So just keep that in mind. All right, next we want to look at the concept clip, the first concept clip for this chapter, and that is what is the difference between de jure and de facto discrimination. I've told you, however, I've told you a little bit about de jure and de facto discrimination at the beginning of class, but I'll go ahead and speak to that before you see the video. So, de jure discrimination would have been the Plessy versus Ferguson type decisions. So it's discrimination based on law. The law says that separate but equal is okay. De facto discrimination, however, is discrimination based on race, sex, religion, ethnicity, the same thing that de jure discrimination is based on. but it's the result from social, economic, cultural biases and conditions. So you'll see how that plays out in the concept clip that McGraw-Hill provides. So it's not a result of the law, it's a result of people and how they choose to live their life. And addressing it is difficult, and determining how to get around de facto discrimination has been difficult for our nation, and that's kind of why we're seeing some of the problems that we're seeing today, because it hasn't been addressed, and it needs to be addressed. So let's watch the clip, and then we'll get to the questions.
Introductory concepts in American government. What is the difference between de jure and de facto segregation? Treating groups differently can lead to separation of groups by race, ethnicity, religion, age, gender, or some other inherent characteristic. This is called segregation. De jure segregation describes separation that exists because of specific laws. De facto segregation describes separation that is present because of the choices of people. It shows segregation in practice in everyday life. One of the goals of any democratic society is equality under the law. In other words, all groups and all people should be treated equally by the government and the legal system. Historically, the United States' legacy of slavery and a diminished role of women in society contributed to unequal treatment of some groups within society. When groups are singled out, it can lead to members of some groups being treated differently by society and the law. Societal protections against discrimination and segregation have evolved over time, starting with the 14th Amendment in 1868. This amendment redefined and extended protections of rights and liberties. The 14th Amendment was ratified in the aftermath of the Emancipation Proclamation and the end of the Civil War. According to the 14th Amendment, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. The goal of the amendment was to ensure that all citizens receive equal treatment under the law. The clauses in the 14th Amendment about preventing segregation are enforcement and equal protection. Under the Enforcement Clause, no state shall make or apply any law that denies to its citizens equal protection of the law. In other words, the government can't make or enforce a law that discriminates against any citizens. The Equal Protection Clause states that all citizens will be given equal protection under the law. In other words, all citizens will be treated equally by the government. The civil rights cases of 1883 were a challenge of the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which guaranteed equality of all persons in the enjoyment of public services provided by privately owned businesses, for instance, attending a movie theater or patronizing a restaurant. On appeal, the Supreme Court ruled that the 14th Amendment only protects against segregation by the state, or de jure segregation. Private segregation and private acts of racial discrimination were not prohibited by the 14th Amendment. The Supreme Court ruled that the 14th Amendment only protects against segregation by the state. However, the interpretation of these clauses has not always fully protected individuals against segregation. While prohibited by the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause initially, the United States Supreme Court ruled that some forms of de jure segregation were allowable. Acts of segregation and racial discrimination conducted by state or local government or private individuals were not prohibited by the 14th Amendment. The separate but equal doctrine. In the 1896 case of Plessy v. Ferguson, it was decided that segregation based on race does not in itself constitute unlawful discrimination. As long as the facilities were equal, separation of races by law, or de jure segregation, does not violate the 14th Amendment. Plessy allowed for both private and public discrimination and segregation because of the separate but equal doctrine. However, starting with the 1954 case, Brown v. Board of Education, the interpretation of the 14th Amendment became more protective of the rights of all citizens. Ending de jure segregation. The dismantling of separate but equal and race-based segregation took many years and was facilitated by a few key court cases and pieces of national legislation. In Brown v. Board of Education, the Supreme Court ended separate but equal in education by ruling that separate facilities for white and black children were inherently unequal and therefore violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. In 1955's Brown 2 case, the Supreme Court considered the timeline for desegregation of schools and declared that such must occur with all deliberate speed. Brown v. Board of Education constituted a direct reversal of the separate but equal doctrine in Plessy v. Ferguson. The court ruled that separate facilities were inherently unequal. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 stated that race-based discrimination in all public accommodations was a violation of the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. Furthermore, violation of the law was punishable by fines and jail time. Today, no form of segregation by law, de jure, is permissible in the United States. But some forms of segregation persist. As one example, a number of highly segregated neighborhoods exist in the United States, which leads to predominantly single-race schools. This happens because of a tendency in individuals to live near others who share the same common racial and ethnic characteristics. This de facto segregation, while problematic, presents questions about the need to force integration when the segregation itself is not the result of force. Should the government actively seek to lessen de facto segregation? Summary. What is the difference between de jure and de facto segregation? Treating groups differently can lead to separation of groups by race, ethnicity, religion, age, gender, or some other inherent characteristic. This is called segregation. De jure and de facto segregation are the two broad types of segregation, whereby groups are separated based on race, religion, or ethnicity. De jure segregation is separation that exists because of specific laws. De facto segregation describes separation that is present because of the choices people make. While prohibited by the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, initially the United States Supreme Court ruled that de jure segregation was not unconstitutional. De jure segregation was finally dismantled when the Supreme Court overturned separate but equal in Brown v. Board of Education and Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. De facto segregation still exists today.
Okay, guys, so you just left off on the de facto, or the difference between de jure and de facto segregation. So we're going to answer the questions that are associated. And before I get into that, I just tell you that I went off camera because it's getting late and I'm looking pretty haggard. So I didn't want to put y'all through that of having to look at me. So hopefully you'll forgive me for just speaking rather than being on camera, but I'll try to be on camera as much as I can. Anyway, Number one, de jure segregation is allowed by what? And that's when the law allows it. And an example of that was Plessy versus Ferguson with the separate but equal doctrine being established by the Supreme Court. Number two, the separate but equal doctrine was established by which Supreme Court decision? And that would be Plessy versus Ferguson. Number three, what is the current status of de jure segregation in the United States? And that is B, segregation is not permitted anywhere. And then number four, what does de facto segregation, why does de facto segregation typically occur? And it's because people choose to live with others who share their racial and ethnic characteristics. And so de facto segregation exists because we have our preferences. So it's not intentional, it's just something that happens. But addressing it is also complicated. All right, number five, last question. What was the goal of the 14th Amendment? And that was ensuring equal treatment under the law. All right, so with the Brown decision in 1954, de jure discrimination was supposed to have ended. No more discrimination by law. Unfortunately, a lot of the southern states didn't get the memo, or they chose not to adhere to Supreme Court precedent. So U.S. federal marshals got involved. This is a little girl by the name of Ruby Bridges. She was 6 years old in 1960 when they had a test group of children, I think about 6 children, going to this school in New Orleans, and they attempted to force integration. Unfortunately for Ruby, that wasn't the most pleasant of experiences, even though when she talks about it, she sounds like a really brave individual, and she actually thought that the people who were there screaming were there for Mardi Gras instead of being there to protest her going to their school. But the video is very good. It's very short. It's about 3 minutes, and it shows her, Ruby, today. And I think today she's 7.
The clash between peaceful protest and violent resistance would produce images that caused the country to sit up and take notice. In New Orleans, on the morning of November 14th, 1960, federal marshals escorted a 6-year-old girl named Ruby Bridges to the local all-white elementary school.
I remember turning onto the street. I saw barricades and police officers and just people everywhere. When I saw all of that, I immediately thought that it was Mardi Gras. I had no idea that they were here to keep me out of the school.
Ruby, were you scared? I would have been terrified.
I wasn't, actually, because, it's very hard for parents, I think, to explain to a 6-year-old what was actually happening.
They didn't say it's a white school, you're making history.
I remember them saying, Ruby, you're going to go to a new school today, and you better behave.
But Ruby was making history. 6 years earlier, after decades of struggle, the NAACP had won a major legal victory, Brown versus Board of Education, in which the Supreme Court declared that the doctrine of separate but equal schools was unconstitutional. But in many places, that triumph did not translate into change. For years after Brown, much of the South simply refused to integrate. Now, Ruby would be one of 6 New Orleans children chosen to desegregate several all-white elementary schools.
They were screaming and shouting and chanting 2, 4, 6, 8. We don't want to integrate.
The mothers of downtown New Orleans screaming at a Negro child as she entered the William Franz Elementary School, first in the city to be integrated.
Once I got into school, all of these people here rushed inside of the building. They were taking out their children. Over 500 kids walked out of school that day.
What is your reaction to the court's decision continuing integration?
We don't want the niggas going in this school.
Well,
It's a white school.
They didn't see a child. They saw change in what they thought was being taken from them. They never saw a child.